Well, I'd like to begin by a little bit of our conversation before the show began. Harold Clurman was saying that there is a false rumor that Broadway is doing well. I think that Broadway has the image that it's never been better, never been bigger, never been stronger. But where is the falseness in the rumor?
The falseness is that it is simply isn't making the profits that it used to make in the 20s and 30s. There aren't as many theaters. There aren't as many productions. And the number of people who come are not as many as there were at that time. It's simply that they're doing better than they were 10 years ago, possibly, or 7 years ago. And it's a way of our giving ourselves illusion, which are not true. It's very typical of our whole society. We're always giving ourselves a hypo so that we won't remember the truth, you know, just... it's a deplorable fault.
Do you mean to say that our Bible, the variety, lies to us about the amount of people that are in there?
No.
Does Variety say that there are more people in there than ever before? I think there's a higher, the gross intake is larger than ever before.
Well, also they give a percentage of what they do of the gross, and it's pretty big. I mean, percentage of capacity.
The percentage of capacity? Well, do you think...
I thought that I share the delusion that you tell about of thinking that there's a craze for the theater.
I think there is a craze for the theater, but it doesn't show up in profits. Nor actually in the amount of play going in the country. That is to say, as far as New York.
Why, theater people aren't interested in money.
I wish they were more interested in money, because then they wouldn't put on so many absolute duds. But what's happened is that the theater is still very attractive to the American people, and that's proved by the number of off-Broadway shows, off-Broadway shows, regional theaters, and the fact that so many kids go to colleges and take up theater and so forth. In other words, there's a feeling for the theater, but the economics of the situation...
No, I think the theater's going to be more attractive than it has been for a long time in the next years to come, because I think that everybody is satiated in what they call the media, whether it's television or whether it's motion pictures. The mechanical forms of entertainment are such that they're inundated with them. They got them all day in their bedroom. Going out to a film as they used to in the old days has even become a big problem. So that in a sense, I think what happens is that people who still do want to go out, but they don't rush as they did in the same way to films nearby, because they have the same thing on their television screens. So I think the reaction to that is to say, where is some live theater? And I think that has a character of its own that never can be replaced or duplicated. In a funny way, I think it's stronger now, the desire for it, than it has been for many years.
I would agree with that. I think also that would extend into other forms of live performance, cabaret, music.
Ballet is very popular.
Ballet has become tremendously popular in the past few years.
Yes, but it seems to me that what is misleading is that we equate Broadway with the theater. Now that's no longer true, because what do we have on Broadway? We have musical comedies, and this year a lot of revivals of musical comedies, old musicals. We have plays that have been successful in London, and we have Neil Simon. Outside of that, there are very few dramatic plays, straight plays as used to be called, on Broadway. The plays which are successful on Broadway, like The Elephant Man and a number of others I could mention, originate off Broadway, because productions become too expensive on Broadway, and the operating cost is too expensive, and the price of seats. So I'm not saying that there's a lack of interest in the theater in the country. Of course there's great interest in the theater and an appetite for it, but the channels of production, the means of production have made it very difficult in the commercial area. That's what I'm saying.
There's less new exciting writing going on.
That's right, as a result of that.
The Kennedy Center and the Lincoln Center and all these new areas, and so many cities now have a big theater business of their own.
There's a subsidized theaters, and I'm all for that. I'm all for those subsidized theaters. But I must make a distinction between what they're saying about the theater, which they talk about in terms only of Broadway, and if they say that it's prospering, it's not true.
You're talking about profit rather than the total attendance.
I don't think the attendance can be as much if they're in the 60s. In the 20s, there were 60 New York theaters.
Yeah.
Well, Harold's...
In the 20s.
In the 20s, and now there are 30. I also say that in the 20s, a play that ran 100 times showed a profit. Now a play has to run about a year at great capacity to show a profit. Well, all that is very disastrous in terms of the expansion of theater. And $22.50 was what I would have played last night if I'd had to pay. If you take your wife and if you have kids, because it was Peter Pan, that's quite a sum of money just to go to theater. So I think that these facts must be faced, because what happens is that we delude ourselves, just as we delude ourselves 5 days before the Shah falls that he's going to win. And that's a whole syndrome that goes on because people refuse to look at facts. They want to hear what's comfortable.
Well, that's an interesting example.
And some of our reviewers repeat this nonsense.
Don't you call Off-Broadway Broadway? I do.
No, I don't call it Off-Broadway.
Sure, that's what in London they
No,
have
it's
all
theater.
the...
I call it Off-Broadway. I call it theater, yes.
Well, the fact is that half of Off-Broadway becomes Broadway now.
It's
If
off-Broadway.
anything comes
That's
in there
what I
that's
mean.
exciting, we move it
Oh,
up.
I think the theater, I'm not
like-
saying the theater doesn't exist. I'm talking about what they call a commercial theater, which is non-commercial.
Wouldn't you consider Off-Broadway something like going out of town? You don't go out of town because it's too expensive. So you open down Off-Broadway instead of the road, instead of
No, the plays are
Philadelphia
different.
or
Because a play like,
Chorus Line?
look, a play like Buried Child, which I think won a prize with a
Sam Shepard, sure, I won a Pulitzer Prize.
It could never fill a house at the Booth Theater. I don't say it should, but I'm saying it could never fill a house.
I don't know how the hell it filled a house down there.
Yeah, but it's very, that's another matter. We're not discussing altogether just values. We're discussing the facts. And the facts are that a lot of the plays, let's say by David Mamet, wrote a play which I didn't happen to like very much called Life in the Theater. To me, it has nothing to do with the theater, but it had to do with dramatic critics' idea of what the theater's like, but which is very remote from the facts again. But it ran for about a season and a half downtown. So as one of the biggest successes off Broadway was Three Penny Opera. But if take it up Broadway, it's not going to run.
It seems to me, looking at Broadway carefully, that there is not a gigantic market, a mass market for serious drama on Broadway. I've seen a couple things
That's
like
what I'm saying.
G.R. Point, for example, with Michael Moriarty. I thought it was a very strong play.
Yes, and he gave a beautiful
terrific
performance.
ensemble performance.
Yes,
Everyone.
I agree.
And the thing closed after a couple of months. I don't know how Loose Ends is doing at the Circle and the Square.
That's doing pretty well.
That's doing pretty well. That is another example, I think, of really solid drama. How long it will stay in there, I don't know. But I don't think there's a gigantic audience of people who want to pay X amount of dollars and go in and have a very serious confrontation with something on the stage.
Whose life is it anyhow is serious.
Yeah, that's doing very
That's
well.
an English
But
play.
it's done with such skill. I don't care where it is. It's a theater.
Yeah,
they
but
go
I want to
to
know why we don't bring our
We're
play.
English, aren't we?
You
We
may
speak
be.
it.
I'm not.
No, he's a wild Russian. We don't count him.
We'll take a break and we'll be back right after this. Continue our conversation. All right, we've just seen a great caricature from Sardi's of George Abbot, and I want to ask Vincent Sardi, where did the whole thing with the theatrical caricatures in your restaurant? We just saw George Abbot here.
There was a very well-known press agent at the time, Irving Hoffman, and there used to be quite a few newspaper men who hung around the restaurant. He brought in this Alex God, who was a Russian refugee, and just for fun, they did caricatures of the people around the table and put them up on the wall. And then Irving approached my father and said, well, why don't you have caricatures done of the people, theater people coming in? And Dad said he couldn't afford it. This was during our depression. And
there was no disputing there was a depression.
Yes,
Oh, yes.
that one we're in. And so he and Alex made a deal where Alex would get 2 meals a day, and for which he would do the caricatures. And 1947, when I took over the management of the restaurant after World War II, I got a hold of Alex. I said, look, this is all silly. First of all, when Prohibition was repealed, he insisted on paying for his drinks because that wasn't part of the original contract. And I said, let's just tear up this paper and, you know, make a fee and we'll pay you for the car. He refused to do it. And until he died shortly after a heart attack, he would never take anything. He would only pay for his meals and not, I mean, would get free meals.
Well, have the celebrities always been happy with the way they're portrayed in the caricatures? By the way, Hal, if you could get me just bring over the copy of George Abbot's. I'd like to have it here for a second. They haven't. What are some of the negative reactions been?
Oh, we had, for example, when we did John Lindsay, when he was, you know, he was so interested in Times Square and everything, and I guess Don Bevan was doing the caricatures then, and made him look very rugged, and so we had to do it over again, make him a little more.
I once heard there was a rumor about Maureen Stapleton and something she did with.
Well, Maureen didn't like her Stapleton, and she can get pretty volatile. She didn't like a caricature, so I noticed she hadn't been around. And finally, one of her mutual friends came and said, you know, Maureen is afraid to come in here because, you know, she stole a caricature, and by gosh, it was gone. I hadn't noticed it.
She stole it from the wall?
She stole it, brought it home, and either burned it or tore it up and threw it in the John. So I sent her a telegram, and I said, come home, all is forgiven, Dad. She started coming back again.
Mr. Abbot, how do you like your caricature?
Oh, fine.
When it was done in 1963, of course, you were only in your 70s then. I think it's a good likeness. You know what I'd like to find?
We can never tell looking at ourselves.
No. How caricatures is supposed to be flattering.
No, it's supposed to what?
It's supposed to exaggerate certain features, that's all. You're not supposed to enjoy a caricature of yourself.
No, that's
Most
true.
people don't.
When you get one that really hits the nose of some weakness, then it's so delicious. The caricatures of Nixon were always so kind of fun.
I always heard that he hated those things when they would appear in the papers, that this was one of his private peeves, when he would see a caricature of himself in the Post or whatever. What do you think, Anita, of George?
No, he's prettier than that.
I was going to say the same thing.
In real life?
He's always been handsome, much handsome.
You know what I thought would be fun for you to tell me and the folks watching about the different ways that you have worked together over the years. Anita, have you ever worked with George Abbot?
I never have. Once I wrote a play that he consented to have read on the stage, and we sat in the audience and listened to it, and it was terrible.
When was it?
Oh, years ago. I'm sure George has forgotten it. It was written by Francis Marion, who was a movie writer.
I remember it, vaguely, not in detail.
You read it over, and you said, well, let's see how this sounds when the actors take hold. So Francis and I and George sat down in the audience and listened to this. It was awful. And that canceled out a big debt he might have run up trying to put it in the theater.
I'm always curious when you go to the theater on an opening night and you see something that is truly awful, and you know that it's awful, and you wonder, why didn't they go through this procedure, and how come the director or the producer just didn't say, this thing stinks? Why? Being from Philadelphia, I would frequently see, I saw a lot of theater growing up, and I would see things coming through that were obviously going to bomb in New York.
I will tell you,
why?
One easy lesson.
What happens?
Love.
Love.
You fall in love with this product and you cannot see it. And you think you're going to get it better, and you never, and by you're blind.
It's a good answer. Good answer.
He's absolutely right.
You're absolutely right.
You know that there's Brooks Atkinson once said something to me that I've never forgotten. He never went backstage when he was a critic. He really kept well away from most theater people. Well, he had a few friends around in the theater, but he didn't discuss their particular work when he was with them. But after he retired, his wife had a book of hers dramatized, and it was done by the Schuberts, by John Schubert, as a matter of fact. And he went with his wife down to see it in Wilmington when it opened. And he thought it was hopeless, absolutely hopeless, and he planned to get a train out at 7 in the morning and leave town.
That bad.
And the producers and the authors who had dramatized her book, was a book she'd written about Russia, called something Uncle Joe. I can't remember exactly the title. Anyway, they asked him, wouldn't he please stay and just say, speak to them for a few minutes. They wanted to ask him a few questions, and so he thought, I can't get out of this. And he said, I can't do it tonight, possibly. He was too shaken and upset by the devastation of the whole thing. So they said, in the morning. And he said, well, I'm getting a train at 7. And they said, well, get one at 8:15. Can't we just meet for half an hour? So he met with them at 7:30 or something, you see. And at 8 o'clock, he canceled the 8:15 train, he said, when he was telling the story. And it got to be 11 o'clock. He said, then I was going to get a 12, but he said, when it got to be 12, I found myself thinking, there's a way out of this.
Well, this leads me naturally to make the inquiry in your vast and varied careers of the times when you have been in love with something and didn't really see it for what it was and went through and ultimately had to regret.
I've done dozens of them that I turned down and said I didn't want. They'd come back to me and they'd flatter me and said, you can fix it. And I go ahead, and it would be a mistake.
Does one specific project come to mind where you were blinded by this love?
It was going to be an adaptation of Anastasia, and I just didn't think it was right.
Why?
Your composers, you know, Forrest and Wright, were such nice fellows, and they'd come back to me and said, hear it again, and they were down south there. And finally I said, well, I thought I could fix it. And they played for me, it was Rachmaninoff's music. They played the song that Anastasia was supposed to sing in an asylum where she was locked up, in which she could remember her past dimly. Well, that was a beautiful song, and that hooked me. And it ruined my perspective because it meant that I had to say Anastasia was the real thing, not a fake. And the basis of the show should have been that it might have been a fake. That was one love that did. The other was that George...
Well, what happened with the project?
It was a failure.
It was a failure.
But I heard George London sing, and I fell in love with him. And then I thought if we could get him to play this leading part, you know, this great opera singer. And I heard him again in a concert, and one part of my mind said, why is that different? And the other part, no, 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 he's great. Don't think of that. And his voice failed us, so we didn't have a big star for the lead at all. We had an understudy. And he never has sung since. And I should have had keenness enough to realize that I must question whether there's something the matter with his voice.
So you part of your mind heard it, but you didn't want to have that problem.
He was perfect.
Which show was that? The same one? Or?
It's called Anya.
Anya. Well, let's pause, and we'll be back to continue along this line. So think about the times you've been in love, and it hasn't worked out. We'll be back.
All the time.
Yes, we're just returning from commercial. First, Vincent Sardi, we thank you for this, and bon appetit to everyone. And another 91 years to you, Mr. Abbott.
Thank you. I'll take less, but that's all right.
Now, we were talking really along two lines. First, I'd like you to tell folks watching about some of the different professional relationships that have evolved among you people over the years, and then keeping in mind that I'm interested in hearing the times you fell in love with a project that it didn't work. Mr. Whitehead.
I mean, the relationships...
The relationships, yes.
Well, as I was saying earlier, when you made the introduction, you omitted to say one very important thing in my life, and that was that there's not many producers who can say that George Abbott worked for them. Well, he did. He was an actor in a production I did.
What was the production?
It was the production of Thornton Wilder's The Skin of Our Teeth, which had also in it Helen Hayes and Mary Martin and Florence Reed and George Abbott.
And George Abbott played at the Bernhardt Theater in Paris.
And played in the Sarah Bernhardt Theater in Paris, and it played in Washington, and it played in Chicago, and then it played in New York for 3 or 4 weeks, and then we did it on television on a 2-hour special for NBC. And I only can remember that one of the great assets of the production was having George Abbott in it. even though he said to me, "You'll never get the performance out of me you'd like to get." I remember him saying that one night when I was worrying about other things, and he happened to make that comment in his crusty way. But you got to say this just to look at him. You know, it was great casting for Mr. Antrobus. It's great casting right now for Mr. Antrobus. Shall we revive it, George?
Yeah, how do you feel about returning to the stage as an actor?
I would love to have a good part, but the trouble is I wouldn't want to run a winter, that's all, so that's fakey. Who wants a part of somebody that, you know, if I were offered a little part on a television show, I'd grab it.
You'd enjoy that, because you enjoy the acting?
Well, I just like to act a little bit, yes.
However, I want to go on with this, because I'd like to add that I haven't, with Miss Loos, we did meet, and as a matter of fact, the musical of hers that you were talking about, she had an earlier plan for it, and I discussed it with her. I remember I came to her apartment, and we talked at some length about it, and we were talking about, this was about 3 years ago, you were thinking of it then. So we did discuss it and discussed the treatment of the book as you had thought about it at that time. As for Harold...
Which book is that? Can you recall?
Happy Birthday.
Happy Birthday, which Imogene Coca is going to be starring.
Imogene Coca is going to do it.
In the spring.
But I knew that you were interested then, and you were doing some...
And Jose Quintero is going to direct.
That's right, Jose Quintero was going to do it.
And
that's quite right.
Our producer has imported from Vienna a scenic artist who is unbelievable. He just did the latest opera production at the Viennese Opera. And so we're bringing him over
When will
to
this
startle Broadway, which he'll do, believe me.
When will this open?
I would think
spring?
around in May.
Good. Well, good luck with it. And what about Mr. Clurman and Mr. Whitehead working together?
Yes, I must say one word, and that is that most of the exciting things that I've done in the theater, and certainly the things that were most enriching to me, I did with Harold. I learned from Harold, and the things that possess the quality of love in the theater that George Abbot was talking about, always had it when I did them with Harold.
Well, what were some of the things you did together?
Bus Stop.
Bus Stop.
Waltz, Corridors. Remember the Wedding, of course, was very notable and so forth. There were many others, played by Berman, and there were many others. But I worked as an actor and as assistant stage manager for George Abbot in one of the plays, which I didn't come into New York with, but which I did on the road as in a small part. I was a dope fiend in it, by the way, which makes me laugh. The leading man was a man by the name of Mooney Weisenfriend, who later on became Paul Muni. It was called Four Walls. And
Now, when was this?
About 1927. And earlier, I think I played a Mexican peon, and I spoke the whole part in Spanish, which I didn't know, but I spoke it very correctly. And it was a Jed Harris production directed by George Abbot called Spread Eagle. And one of the things I remember about is not my appearance in these plays, and also I did another tryout of a play that John Golden produced, is that I learned a great deal about direction from George Abbot and very often quote him, very often read the law to certain people about certain aspects of direction and so forth. I quote George Abbot instead of some Max Reinhardt or somebody else.
I'd be curious to hear what some of the quotes are, some of the
one of the laws
according to Abbot.
I remember one little thing that I mentioned the other day to a playwright who had lines that he didn't need. And I remember there was in the Four Walls, which took place on the East Side, there was a line where the mother says, "The street gives off music." And Mr. Abbot said, "You don't need that line because we hear the music. So hearing the music is much better than pointing it out to the audience. Let them hear it and feel the effect." That was a very wise thing. And when a man like Paul Muni, who was a marvelous actor, of course, and Mr. Abbot appreciated him thoroughly. I remember one time he got very temperamental, and Mr. Abbot, who almost never raises his voice, who never quarrels with anybody, who never acts like a sergeant major at all, said, "Don't do that," very quietly. "It won't work with me." And he immediately quieted down, and he never raised his voice again. And I know why, because if Mr. Abbot has some directors might normally respond in kind and get angry and threaten or or get insulted, he would have loved it. He would have loved it. But the very quiet way he said, don't do that. It's not going to work. Made him change and made me learn that you don't always respond because an actor's temperamental and get angry at him in turn. But so there are many other things I could go on a long time, but I don't want to take up the time. But I liked a great deal from Mr. Abbot.
I think that's a terrific tribute. Now, I'd be curious to hear a little bit about your thoughts of working with actors and in dealing with the ego of so-called stars, the people who are up there, the headliners. You're in charge of directing them, as you have been so many, many times. Have you developed a basic philosophy?
Yes. Know what you're talking about. Actors get temperamental because they know that something's wrong, and they don't know how to fix it, but they just know that things are wrong, and so they strike out in all directions. But if an actor knows that you're helping making him good, then he isn't going to fight with you.
Also, again, to all of you, and dealing with the problem, the opening night jitters, knowing that the critic is out there, knowing that, you know, the money is on the line tonight, were there any special things that you would try to do before the opening night performance?
Yes, and I think most of them are wrong. I really don't know how to do that. I just don't know how. I had a play, Music Is, you know, see, which we went so well in your theater in Washington, and went out well on the road, and I talked to the cast or the opening performance, and I said, now try to be honest and play the parts for the character in them and so forth. And they gave the dreariest down performance that I ever saw. And of course, I should have said to them afterward, I thought I should say, get in there and hit them. Yeah. You know, and I don't know what. That was my trying to get a true performance out of them and not get them to mug. I guess I got them to drag.
Could you go back at intermission and say anything, or is that?
I didn't dare. I didn't. No, I just said and died in the back row.
Let's pause for a second. We'll be back to continue after this. Vincent Sardi is one of our guests this afternoon, and I think it'd be interesting to hear your account of how theater has changed, based on what has happened, with the kind of crowds who come in the Sardis, how they may have changed over the years, and also the opening night traditions and how the parties have changed, because it isn't the way it used to be.
No, but one thing I've noticed is that there's a lot of young people going to the theater. We notice it, especially during the summertime. In spite of the prices, or maybe possibly that ticket booth on Times Square draws them, and they come in and they may not have a whole meal. They may not have a whole meal. They may just have a drink, or they may sit down and have a snack, you might say. But we do get an awful lot of young people, and then we have a lot of these drama schools or classes from different colleges all over the United States that come in, and you know, there'll be 10 or 12 of them, and they'll call up and see if they can make a reservation, that kind of thing. So I know where they're coming from. And that seems to be growing every year, more and more, the young people.
But what about the professionals with regard to Sardis? Now, have you had situations over the years where you have had weeping stars because they're there with the New York Times and they see the bad review, you know, at 2:30 in the morning or something like that?
Yes, that does happen, you know, as we know too well. Now, last night was pretty good.
What do you do? 12:30.
12:30. That's
the weeping begins.
The weeping begins. Well, last year there was a lot of weeping with the New York Times reviews were pretty strong. And there was quite a lot of downcast people. But this lady who just did a solo, what's her name, Rain? Radner. Now,
Gilda Radner. I was there that night.
Well, she cried that night, and yet she did fantastic business.
You know, it was really funny.
Yeah.
I was there, and I actually was sitting at the table talking to a couple of people, and someone said, Gilda is in the ladies' room crying.
Yeah.
That's what I said.
Really?
Yes.
She's in the ladies' room crying.
That's right.
Because of something. It wasn't even that bad a review, but it wasn't a great review.
It was not.
So I went in, you know, and there were all these men and women in the ladies' room all gathered around.
I was wondering, you went to the...
Yeah, everyone was in the ladies' room, hanging out, you know, touching her and saying, it's great, you were great. And I read the review when I got my Times the next morning, and I saw what she meant, because it just wasn't like a home run type review. And yet she was terrific.
And they extended the run.
And they extended the run.
Yeah.
But
if you get 6 favorable reviews and 1 bad one,
you're going to cry.
You cry, and that's all you remember is the 1 bad review.
Well, we just got a very horrible thing in New York Magazine.
Remember that one.
That's right.
You're sustained by the others.
You got a bad review
in New York Magazine. A fellow said something about narcissistic Broadway actors who sit there under these leering caricatures, and it's a house of horrors. Well, you don't like it.
But you remembered it.
I remember.
You remembered it word for word.
And one of the strange reactions is that all my friends called up and wrote me letters saying, "Don't worry about it. It's not true. And you know, we like the place." And I've so far gotten letters from as far as California already. But nobody likes a bad review. I mean, even if even when you agree with it, sometimes you don't like it. And we're just as vulnerable in the restaurant.
But what do you do whether you're the host of the people at the party and that like Gilda or whoever, they feel terrible, or you're the producer of the show, or you're the director of the show, or the director of the show, or the author of the show? What do you do when you have to really look the person in the eyes who's gotten, who's really been panned? What do you say to them?
You tell them, pay no attention.
Pay no attention.
No,
you sympathize. In other words, you share the outrage.
It's not possible, but you tell them, pay no attention.
That's all you can do.
Say, I've been insulted, but better critics.
I think you have to have a sense of human and philosophy.
Yes,
otherwise,
surely.
Otherwise,
they kill you. Otherwise, they'll kill you.
Go ahead, Vincent.
Well, the same thing in the restaurant where there practically isn't a day that goes by that something doesn't happen. And if everything that happens, I mean, it can be a waiter spilling something on someone, or a reservation that's not properly taken.
Some ego gets damaged.
Every time you think it's going great, something happens.
Sure.
But you have to have an ego that will carry you through that. I always remember Mrs. Whitehead. We had a big thing on television, NBC. It was called The Great Event, or The Big Event. Alvin Koopman did it, and he said, "We want a special menu. We don't want anything that you normally serve." Anything. Now, Martin, my banquet manager, has been serving this, is British, and so he ordered Scotch grouse. So here we serve 200 and some odd people on television, Scotch grouse, which has to be cooked practically raw to begin with. And all of a sudden I hear, "Vincent, what is this crap?" Zoe Colwell, who has a magnificent voice, and it
coast to coast.
Ran in the kitchen, got a piece of roast beef, ran out here the roast beef.
I was out of town with a show at that time. I'm glad to say it.
You didn't hear it?
I heard about it.
You met in Philadelphia?
No,
So that happens. But then, of course, you were saying about, when you're falling in love with something. I opened an East Side restaurant quite a few years ago.
What was it called?
It was called Sardi's East. And I wanted to do everything what I saw wrong at my place on the West Side, I wanted to improve on the East Side. The tables were bigger, there was more space. We got away from the theatrical decor, and it was, completely different decor. Had a French chef, a French head waiter, completely different menu. The only thing that was the same that when I bought this location was the men's room and the ladies' room. And the only thing that nobody complained about was the men's room and the ladies' room. They complained about everything else. We ran until May. And the minute that I opened it, I knew it was wrong.
Why? How did you know that?
Just the feeling, the reaction. It was wrong. I couldn't get out of it.
Several years.
I closed it at the end of that summer. At the end, I had to run through the winter. Closed it, redid the whole place, and started all over.
Oh, yes.
The only way, and luckily I was undercapitalized. I was overcapitalized, so I could carry it through. Otherwise, it would have folded. But I lost track of it. I didn't see what was wrong. And then the minute you open it, the minute people came in, you knew it was wrong.
We have to take a break. We'll be back. I'd like to extend that into theater. Who was supposed to keep it on track? The producer, the director, whoever?
Both.
Think about that. Both. We'll be back right after this. This is an incredible story.
Come back at you after 60 years and they're doing it in Toronto.
Well, we're in the process of hearing the story from Anita Loos about a play she wrote 60 years ago, which has been dormant for 60 years, and all of a sudden the phone rang.
For 60 years it was
someone wants
dormant.
to produce it?
I had never thought of it again. And
what was it called? What's the title of the play?
It was called The Whole Town's Talking.
You wrote it?
And one day, when I was in Hollywood, Harry Cohen called me up and said, "We've just done a movie, and we have no title for it. Would you mind if we used your title?" And I said, "No, go
They took
ahead."
The Whole Town's Talking, the title.
The Whole Town's Talking.
Well, where do you think
That's the last I ever heard of it until about, well, I'll say 4 months ago, I get a word from Canada that they want to put it on at the theater that's connected with the university there. And it is now going on after 60 years.
Anita, could you just take a minute and tell us how you got started in movies? You were writing films and scenarios that were directed by D.W. Griffith, and
Yes.
I'd really like to know how you began, how it all started for you.
I was a stage child, and I played parts when I was 7 years old. And
Did your father have a theater?
my father had a theater. And it struck me one day that movies must need a plot before they start shooting.
Well,
And
what
I
year
wrote
was
one.
this about when you produced this?
1925.
It was before,
No.
no, it was before 1925.
Oh, no, long, 1917.
1917.
1917. And I wrote out a plot, and I climbed up into the projection room and got the can, the film can, and copied the address of the Biograph Film Company and mailed my plot. And within a week, I got a check for $25.
$25 was good.
And at that time, I was acting in my father's company for $15 a week. And I said, this is where
There's
I quit
money
acting.
in writing, huh?
This is the
So,
end.
can you recall what that first one was and what became of it? Was
Yes.
it actually made into a
It
film?
was called The New York Hat, and it's still played at the Museum of Modern Art. And it is the picture that David Griffith saw when he chose Mary Pickford to go into the theater. And,
That's incredible. So from that one thing of being clever enough to copy the address.
Following that, I wrote 200 films for D.W. Griffith before sound came in.
How did you feel about the advent of sound? After being so successful working in the silent medium, writing the scenarios, all of a sudden the technology moves a step. How did you...
Well, I had quit movies at that time because they were very profitable and I was rich. And I quit. Then came the crash and I had to go back to work. And when I went back to work, I was sent for by Irving Thalberg and to write a sound movie. And he had a property called A Red-Headed Woman, which he had given to Scott Fitzgerald to make a scenario of. Now Scott, with the most idiotic intention in the world, wanted to be a movie writer. With all his great talent, with his genius, with his success, he only wanted to write a movie. And he wrote a movie of a red-headed woman, and it was deadly.
Yes, I've always been curious as why Scott Fitzgerald wasn't able to transfer that talent, the great talent as a screenwriter.
He made a sort of a Valentine out of it. And so Irving sent for me. This was in 1926. And he said, will you take this script and make it funny? So I did, and that was Jean Harlow.
Jean Harlow. What a start.
And that was the first Jean Harlow success. She became overnight a star. Then I wrote any number of films for Gene after that.
What was the name of that film? What was the name of the film?
The film was A Red-Headed Woman.
The Red-Headed Woman.
And it still runs up on Broadway in that theater.
I still didn't hear what, so you didn't really mind too much when sound came in. You didn't feel threatened. But you were semi-retired at the time.
I was so involved in outside things, I didn't care what happened to the movies.
All right. Let me take a break, and we'll be back right after this. It's a good publishing house. This, I have a copy of George Abbot's novel. This is your first novel.
Yes.
It's called Tryout, and I'd like to take a minute and tell us about it.
Well, it's not entirely about a tryout. It's about Palm Beach. But it's about an actor who gets involved down there. And I can't think of anything duller than my trying to tell you the story at this point.
You don't have to, but it draws upon...
Don't tell it, because then people won't buy it. They'll think they've already
You know how it comes out, eh?
Well, how did you enjoy writing a novel?
I enjoyed it. I put no pressure on myself, and a certain freedom about that work that you don't have in the theater. When you're in the theater and you're writing, you're compressed within a set. When you're writing a novel, if you want somebody to go to London, he can go to London.
Yeah.
A funny thing happened to me in that thing. When Mr. Gleason, who was the editor in the Playboy, said, "Why do you keep changing tenses?" And then I realized, of course, in the theater, if we write directions, we say, he goes to the door, looks out, and slams the door. But in a novel, you say it in the past tense. Mm-hmm. Well, in my habit for long years of writing what I thought I saw people doing, made me jump into the present tense. So I keep baffling him.
Well, that's easy enough to change. You know, just as I had asked Anita about her very early days and her start in the business, I'd like to ask you the same question. How did you begin, George Abbot?
I always thought I'd like to be a writer. When I was in college, I was pretty good at as an actor.
Where did you go to college?
Well, I went to the University of Rochester. So then I went down to Harvard and took Baker's course down there, which was a theater course. And then I wrote, while I was working for him, a play that won a prize, and I had one done by the Harvard Dramatic Club. And I thought there's nothing to it. And I'd come to New York and be an actor until somebody grabbed up my great plays. And I don't know, about 7 or 8 years later, my first one was done.
So did you come to New York and were you pretty successful right off the bat as an actor?
No, not right off the bat.
What?
Well, my first thing, I was pretty good, yes. There was a play called The Misleading Lady, and I was brought in. Then we didn't audition the way we do now. They'd see you in the office, and they could fire you and change and rehearse for 11 weeks if they wanted to.
When was this? About what year?
1914.
1914.
And
who was it? L.C. Ferguson?
No, it was Paul Dickey as it wrote it, and Stone.
Fred Stone?
Louis Stone.
Louis Stone.
Man. And I had little straight parts, you know, say, let's have drinks, boys, or something. And they fired a fellow that was playing a drunken college boy. So they threw me in temporarily. Well, that was just my dish, you see, and I let go at it, and right away I got not only that part, but the better part. Because
so you're off to
it was a character thing, you see, that I could do very well. So that was, I got, you know, what they call some notices out of it. And then again, I thought it was easy, but I had some bad times getting jobs. then finally I became...
What did you do between jobs? What kind of work?
Look for work.
What were some...
Wrote. Oh, no, I kept writing.
You kept writing the
Yeah,
whole time?
yeah.
And where did you live?
I lived in New York.
No, where in New York?
Way up near Spuyten Duyvil, most of the time.
I don't even know where that is.
Well, that's up to
200th
200th Street.
200 something.
Yeah.
It's way up there.
And I was a pretty good actor, and I thought that Mr. Clurman was in one of my shows I acted in. What's the name of it, Harold?
Processional.
Processional. I was the leading man in that, and I was pretty good, wasn't I?
John, yes, you were very good. John Lawson, John Howard Lawson. June
Didn't you
Walker
do
was
that?
it.
And then while that was
Didn't you
on, I
in the
got
group then?
sold my first play, a thing I
Gilded,
wrote with Jimmy
the
Gleason,
Gilded.
called The Fall Guy, and I quit to direct it. And then I didn't act again until I worked for Mr. Whitehead.
Many years then went by.
A great many.
So once you sold your first play, that was your entree as a director. You used your
Yes.
writing skills to get yourself... But what about your training as a director? Were there any mentors or any people whom you felt...
Yes, there's a fellow you never heard of called Winchell Smith, who was a wonderful director.
Did he write Lightning? He wrote Lightning.
Yes, and he
Lightning.
directed.
And it was
and he
produced
wrote
twice, like.
Yeah, and he wrote to tell the truth. I mean,
Nothing But the Truth?
Nothing But the Truth.
Was William
no,
Collins?
no, what was it about the convicts coming home?
That's another play. But I remember those old
But
plays.
anyhow,
Winchell Smith. So what did you learn from him?
honestly in acting, no phoniness. And I think that was my instinct too, because I remember once I lost a part. I was auditioned for a part over in a stock company in Brooklyn, and I wasn't broad enough to suit them. And the fella kept telling me, lay it on with a shovel. And I said, I can't do it, and I quit.
Now,
I couldn't mug that way.
you didn't want to do it in results
And I still
terms. They
think
were
the
asking
custard
for...
pie is the lowest form of comedy.
This is not custard pie. This is very good. What are we having here for
When
dessert?
was that?
We don't get that at the end, do we?
This is
was
Boccone
that?
Dolce.
When was that? When he fired you?
Mouth, huh?
What time? What do you
That would
know
be
about
in the
what?
in the early teens, that
Yeah.
would be before 20s.
That's when the whole thing really began to change. When that kind of
But
reality
I've always had an
came in.
instinct that way that you must be honest, even for comedy. You know that
Yeah.
that you got your value out of comedy by making you think it was real.
Yes.
Prior to that, what was the acting style? How would
Well,
you
it was an
describe
imitation of all sorts of styles from all over the world, really. It was European generally, and I suppose being
Burlesque
as high
influence?
class as possible, an imitation of
Very
English.
much under the influence of the English theater.
English
The
theater,
English
mainly.
theater, formal theater.
And they're still mugging
Then
over
O'Neill
there.
came along.
And their acting is great, but when they get to low comedy, they have, and the audience will laugh at it. The slapstick.
That's interesting. Very interesting.
That's because they're such a formal people. That's a relief to have slapstick.
I
Something to be that
never
broad.
can understand how their taste is so meticulous
Yeah.
in the higher forms of theater, but when you come to farce, they're just childish.
Oh, let's talk about bedroom force. That's interesting. We'll have to take a break
Oh, I'd be delighted.
right after this. We'll come back to the break. Now,
New England or Rochester?
I don't like to ask people to do this when we talk about things while the commercials are on, but this is worthy of asking George Abbott to repeat. We were talking about smoking, and Vincent Sardi said, how many young people are smoking? And we all know that's not good for us. And George Abbott, you're 92 now, George?
Yep.
92 years old, explained why he never started smoking. Repeat that advice your mother gave you.
Well, it was advice from my mother, who said, it may do you some harm, it can't do you any good, and it's expensive.
That's what
Good advice. So you never started. Now, Robert Whitehead, we want to talk a little bit about bedroom farce. We're talking about English comedy, low comedy. Where does bedroom farce fit in on the comedic scale?
Oh, I think it's high comedy.
High
in a
comedy,
sense.
verbal comedy.
Yes, high comedy and verbal comedy, yes. It isn't a sex farce, though it seems as if it might be, but the title, I think the title perhaps misleads some people.
Well, the English cast was here, and I think there were 1 or 2 Tony Awards, correct?
There were 2 Tony Awards, but there were for the actors, yes.
And other nominations.
And other nominations, yes.
They left, and they were now replaced by an American cast. What kind of problems does that...
Well, it was a problem, but it was a pleasurable problem. I loathed the idea of having to replace the English cast, because I had an agreement with Equity, whereby I had to finally replace all of them within a period of 14 weeks or so, and 12 weeks after we opened in New York. So no sooner had we opened to these glorious notices, and then I had to suddenly settle down and start finding actors to do not only a replacement, but an entire company. So that I approached it with a sense of frustration and anger, but in the process of doing it, I found it was a pleasure, and I got a great kick out of it, because I found people, it was as if I was redoing a whole production in a different way, and we found people that seemed to me as exciting, in some cases more exciting. And in a way, I think the production is more fun for the audience now than it was then.
Now,
so
tell us who the cast is now.
Well, the leading people in it are Mildred Natwick.
So she's great.
Bob Coote and John Lithgow.
Terrific.
There are a number of other actors I won't go into, though I'm grateful to all of them, because they're all lovely in it. But and I think that really it's more fun in a way than it was then, though. It's different, that's all. It's different, and I admired it enormously in the beginning, and I enjoyed doing it with the English company.
What is your biggest problem as a producer in translating or interpreting what bedroom farce is to the general public so it can have a commercial success and stay afloat?
Well, I suppose that, you mean, how can I say it in a few words?
What do you try to let people know it is in order to induce them to come to the theater? If you don't have a star who they want to run and see, how do you make it happen?
The stage consists of 3 bedrooms, all of which have a connection through relations or in one way or another. And in those 3 bedrooms, everybody's trying to solve the problem of their lives, and in doing it, they become ludicrous. It isn't a sex comedy, though it involves sex in the very deepest sense. But it is indeed a ludicrous, charming, and funny and touching play.
Now, you know what I meant by my question was, I meant try to explain how you interpret it through advertising to the person who wants to buy a Broadway ticket. How do you sell bedroom farce?
He has quotes already for it.
Quotes. You use quotes. That's what I mean. That's what I want to talk about.
Because
what are the vehicles that you use to sell a
Well, that's
show?
the main vehicle. The main vehicle you use is that they're quotes, because every critic reviewed it magnificently.
You got excellent reviews.
Got excellent reviews, and greater reviews than I had expected. Of course, I never expect great reviews. I always feel grateful if they happen, and I feel, my God, how marvelous we got away with this.
It's a strange thing. When you hear an American actor doing an English accent, you can understand it better.
That's true, and that's been one of the things I think that makes it somewhat more realized for an audience, for the audience now. Though it seems totally believable that everybody in it is English and comes from the English countryside. Somehow, I think it's clearer to the audience, and in a way, it's more fun for them.
Why did you say on the commercial break that a comedy almost never would win a Tony Award?
Well, it happens to be
true
to be a fact of life. That when awards are given out, they will nominate a comedy, perhaps, and 2 or 3 more serious plays, but you can be sure the comedy won't win it. And though the comedy may be much more skillful, and it is more difficult to write, and it is more difficult to act, because it's easier to scream, it seems to me, than play comedy with skill and truthfulness.
Yeah.
Also, we have
the fact is, it'll seldom win it.
We have a very superficial idea what comedy is. We think comedy is as a play with yaks. Actually, comedy is a serious form of theater. But as we know from Molière, as we know from Shakespeare, as we know from Molière, as we know from Congreve.
As we know from George Abbot.
Yeah, as we know from George Abbot. But it's a serious form of theater. And it's simply the truth of life turned into humor. That's right, instead of just into... Because a fakey comedy is no good either. It's no good. But we think of it as something close to burlesque almost. That you just laugh and there's no thought involved at all.
I thought also, before I had mentioned something, then we went to a commercial, about keeping a project on track. Vincent Sardi said, Sardi's East, somehow you lost track of it for whatever the reason. In the evolution of a Broadway, or a show, theater, whether it's a play or a musical, whose responsibility is it to keep it on track? And what is the relationship between the producer and the directors?
The producer tells the director he ought to be there once a month, or once every 3 weeks or 2 weeks, and the director is generally very reluctant to go.
You do it. The director says you do it.
Yes, and but he finally is forced to do it, and the actors complain. But there's something very painful to me to watch a play I've directed, and when it gets to slip, I just get desperate. But if the director generally put in the contract, you have to see the play at least 3 weeks. Once every 3 weeks, which I've learned to do without too much agony.
To go in to keep it tight.
And see if you can help it. At a certain point, it's very hard to help it because after 6 months, many actors are like wet tennis balls. They don't respond very easily. That's the difficulty with going on. Only very actors with very strong technique can keep up a play.
New each night. But
the actors bother him, and the director bothers him, and he's told he's a disgrace if he doesn't fix the play and so forth.
I'll send a note backstage. You're like a wet tennis ball. You'll probably.
Over the years, George Abbott, what have you tried to do in your relationship to producers when you have been the director? What have your ground rules been about the producers' involvement in your project?
Well, I became a producer for many years to get away from producers.
What didn't you like about them?
They were useless. In those days, I don't think they are now, but they at that time.
I think they're useless now.
Wait a second, you're a producer. Why do you think you're useless?
Oh, he's being
Well, that's
modest.
another
He's being
discussion.
modest.
No, there are useful producers, and there are producers who do nothing except raise the money and hire people, and so I just thought I'd get away from somebody whispering in my ear, "Don't you think we ought to do so and so?" And then I had a couple of stage managers named Bobby Griffith and Hal Prince who brought me a play that they wanted to have made into a musical, and that was Pajama Game, and it went so well, I thought, well, these fellas are better producers than I am. I'll work for them from now on, you see? So I never produced since.
So what did you work with Griffith and Prince? What you did?
Well,
Pajama
a
Game?
whole series of shows, Pajama Game, and then some
Yankees.
plays that weren't so good,
Damn
Tenderloin and
Yankees,
something
marvelous.
else.
Damn Yankees.
Damn Yankees. Funny thing happened on the way to the Forum.
Great stuff. How do you recall, if I were to say, a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, in stream of consciousness, what comes to mind?
How long it was when I took it over.
How long was it?
It was awful long.
Who had been working on it? Tell us a story.
Well, the people who had been working on it were very happy to have it cut. I must say they were delighted to have someone take over and show them what to do.
They're too close to it. They can't see what you see as a fresh director. Yeah. What happens with the material that they're in love with a ballad or they're in love with a song, but you realize it just...
Well, that happens, but you generally, if a director is strong and they trust him, they will experiment.
I have a remark that I always make, which I stole from a old German director way back in the 90s, and he told playwrights, "What's cut can't flop."
Actually, that's really true. I'm just in the process of editing a book which I wrote, a novel, and it's interesting to see how you put things in at one point and they seem so perfect, but then let a certain amount of time go by, right? A month. Go back to it and look at it again, and you have a different eye.
That's
somehow
true with everything.
You see, a certain amount of time has to pass. But that's what's so difficult, I think, when you are involved with any project from the outset, right? From day one.
If a director could only fix it, so he went out and put the show on the road and then went home for 2 or 3 weeks, and when he came back, he would see things he had not seen before.
You could do that in
Yes,
repertory
that's true.
theater,
Yeah,
where they
that's
change,
very
but
true.
can't do it in 4 weeks or 8 weeks.
I want to try something else again with the same stream of consciousness. If I say, "Damn Yankees," what comes to mind?
Oh, Gwen Verdon, I suppose.
Yes, that's right. She looked wonderful.
Absolutely. I saw it in Philadelphia when I was at
That big light flash. That big light flash. Wasn't there a blinding flash of light in there?
And the devil came out?
No, there was. It was at some point in there.
Oh, no, it's
And I remember
in the baseball game.
I remember speaking to you. And
We
you were
light- we
saying,
lighted the audience,
That's right.
yeah,
and you
yeah.
said, I don't think this is going to work. This is going to
Oh,
work.
no, I knew
it
that
worked
was gonna
marvelously.
work.
I remember you seemed concerned about that.
Oh, I always thought that would work. We suddenly put the lights on
That's
the
right.
audience and
You
made them
suddenly hit
feel
it.
as if they were
Yeah,
at
it
the
was
baseball
quite
game.
At the
No,
baseball game, yeah.
no,
Like big lights
That
hit.
was my idea. I always thought that would work.
Yeah.
We'll be back right after this to continue.
Well, because of the energy that...
Well, we just
that
have
had
1
been
minute
directed.
left, and in the minute, first I'd like to remind you that George Abbott's first novel is available. It is called Tryout.
Don't forget that.
No, I
That's
haven't
why
forgotten.
we're here.
Novelists of all ages remind me to do that. And so here's George Abbott's book. It's published by Playboy Press, and I really, it's been a great pleasure having you with us. Thank you, Mr. Abbott. Anita Loos, good luck with the new project in the spring. Thank you for being here. Harold Clurman, a pleasure, really.
Thank you.
Vincent, I will see you at the restaurant at some point in the future.
Okay.
And Robert, thank you, and continued
you so
success
much.
with Bedroom
What is
Farce.
that?
Thank you.
I don't know, there's
Is that
some
thunder?
thunder or something upstairs in the building today. At any rate, I
Every
thank
time it
you
says
for
Bedroom
watching, and I
Farce.
hope you have a nice afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow on midday. Bye-bye.